Hello, I'm Michele Acuto.
And I'm Caitlin Morrissey. And in this episode, we are talking about Latin American cities, storytelling, and serendipity. Welcome to the mini-series Walking the City With, hosted by the Urban Studies podcast. This is a series all about the people behind the ideas in urban research. We take them out of their books, their articles, and away from their lecture theatres, their offices, their panels and seminars, and we quite literally walk the talk with the authors and editors in urban studies. And this is a special podcast because these episodes have been peer-reviewed, just like we would do with papers in the journal.
So Caitlin, who did you take out this time?
So this time, Michele, I stepped out with Catalina Ortiz, and Catalina is a professor of critical urban pedagogy in the Bartlett Development Unit at University College London, and she is the director of the UCL Urban Lab. So if you've listened to any of the other walks that I've taken our scholars out on in this series, you might understand why I was beginning to feel like I'd pulled the short straw when it came to the weather. But on this gloriously sunny day, I had the honour of stealing Catalina away from a busy day of conferencing at the RGS to learn more about her work as an urban studies scholar.
There you go, let's get some sun. Vamos!
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. First question we wanted to ask you was to understand a little bit more how you got into urban studies.
Yeah, this is like an interesting question, and the fact that we are walking the city while we discuss this has a lot to do with it. Even I call myself in my Instagram as an urban walker.
Oh, yes.
Because I got fascinated just to wander around cities. I studied architecture. I've been always interested in space and shapes and forms. And my uncle studied urbanism back in the days, and I was looking at his paintings of different cities of the world and different landscapes, and he inspired me a lot to actually understand what is it, how that is done, and what would it mean to go and travel and see other places and other possibilities of urban life. But then through architecture, when I reached, I could say, the 7th semester, we started studying a different scale. And it was the scale of design, like of urban design, and how to think not beyond the building and the kind of composition of an architectural project, but thinking more in the city in a more open way. And one of the projects was designing a longitudinal park along the river, and open up tons of questions for me, because then the questions were beyond the design composition questions and more in terms of who's inhabiting the places, who's governing the places, how you make possible that even these projects can actually happen. And then I realized quickly that it was within the architecture discipline and the tools that I was kind of receiving was not enough to actually understand all these dynamics and how this spatial imagination that design provides you can be enacted. Yes. So I got into a master's degree in urban and regional studies. Yes. When I was right after I finished my degree in architecture, and I quickly felt very comfortable with this more inter-transdisciplinary approach to understand the space and the governing of space. And then I was much more interested in public spaces, the dynamic of public spaces, and how can we even generate public spaces. In my case, I'm from a small city in Colombia in the south that is called Pasto. And for me, it was always very puzzling why in some other places in the world you can have these beautiful parks, and here it seems to be very hard to have, decent public space to just walk the city and being able to have continuity in the pedestrian lines, like very mundane concerns about it, and then escalated to understand more like the complexities of what does it produce or blocks to produce this type of configurations.
I love this idea of the mundane concerns or observations in our everyday lives being the seeds of these deeper political questions of provision or scarcity that then shape our scholarship. So why are there less parks in this city compared to other cities? Why does your neighbourhood have public transport when mine doesn't? And so on.
Yeah, I always love how we start with this sort of personal story behind it, and they take us back to their journey as we walk with them. I think what was very interesting to me here was the return to urban studies and to studying of someone that has been a practitioner and has done those comparative gestures as you're flagging, but also goes back to thinking through them and struggles with justifying a lot of this versus the Anglophone tradition of urban studies. So I think we'll hear much more in the interview on how she displaces the narrative and how she plays with narratives. But what a great starting point.
And on that note, when it came to talking about Catalina's recent work, I wanted to highlight a few of her recent publications. I first asked about her special virtue issue on Latin American cities in the Urban Studies Journal. In this special issue, she analysed Latin American representation in the journal's owner archives. She then curated a vast selection of papers on Latin American cities from the journal that dated from the 1970s right up to the 2020s. I really wanted to know, though, what was Catalina's motivation for this special issue?
Well, yes, that is also, some long-term preoccupation in a way. When I was doing my PhD in the US in Chicago, the first encounter you have with the Anglo-Saxon academic world is that you need to justify a lot. Where are you coming from? What traditions, and try to, in a way, embrace the Anglo-Saxon tradition and the different kind of Western-centric perspectives of understanding the city and urbanization processes. And I was it came out of frustration of showing that there are urban intellectual traditions that come from Latin America, that we have had great thinkers and practitioners of the urban, and that the fact that perhaps my teachers were not engaging with them and didn't know them was also symptomatic of a bigger problem, right? Somehow I started trying to, in a way, show that there are multiple traditions and genealogies of urban thought, that the richness of urban scholarship in the region is very multifaceted. When I was doing my dissertation, it was perhaps something at the background, but as I said, it was trying to justify why studying, for instance, cities in Colombia matter to understanding urban studies more broadly, and in particular, in my case, the planning practices themselves. And to what extent, as well, many of the very sophisticated planning strategies and practices in Colombia could even illuminate and give many lessons to cities, for instance, in the US, where I was based. So in a way, my thinking about Latin American cities and precisely what is the urban thought from the region came more as a reaction to this perception of there's nothing going on there. So that was kind of a very initial seed many years ago. And ever since, I've been interested in understanding, my colleagues, my peers, and joining them in different, journeys of also bumping into the limitations of writing the American city, the Latin American city, and questioning if there's even such a thing as the Latin American city as a one thing.
Well, back for a moment in the studio, I think you really didn't have any troubles in getting Catalina to go along with the theme of walking and traveling and global urbanism here. I really loved the unpacking of the question with a reaction, in a sense, of her approach to theorizing and to urban studies that happens from traveling back to Latin America after Chicago and after London. And I think this ties quite well with some of the other episodes and sort of people like Jenny Robinson sort of re-seeing their own original context from another context like London, and how we're seeing the multiple genealogies of urban thought through that travel.
It was so fascinating to hear this from Catalina. And back to the walk, one of the big conclusions from the paper that we've just been discussing was that Latin American cities have been featured in the Urban Studies Journal, but some are overrepresented and some are not represented at all. And for Catalina, this wasn't only a symptom of the Western ontological problem and seeing cities, but a reflection of structural issues in the academic system.
Yeah, I think something that when the journal invited me to do this virtual special issue on Latin American cities, well, on the one hand, I was problematizing the very idea of having this category, but more treating it as an epistemic space of engagement. And methodologically, what I engaged with the archive of articles that have been published in the journal. So in a way, my sample was very specific.
Yes.
Right? So from that archive, part of the question was, who can really afford to publish and have a say in what are these urbanization processes in Latin America? As we know, there's this very asymmetric access to research funding and very different capacities to engage with the Anglo-Saxon and publishing world. And something that I was finding in a way in analyzing this archive is that on the one hand, either Latin America has been just one more case study of the predominant paradigms of how urbanization has been understood, and in less cases about the speaking and foregrounding epistemics created in the region to understand and name the processes that are happening there. Because regionally also how the distribution, and in that case we need to address kind of the political economy of higher education, is unevenly distributed in the cities and in the countries such as Mexico, Chile, and Brazil, where there has been perhaps much more support for and funding for research, and also the amount of postgraduate studies and the ability of the governments to fund the scholars to get PhDs and so on and so forth. So there's a correlationship between kind of the national infrastructures for research and science and technology with the ability to actually publish. And I think that is one of the reasons I think there's this asymmetry as well in terms of engaging with different places, processes, and localities. And one big absence was, for instance, all the Caribbean or countries that usually are less under the radar of the traditional case studies that everyone knows and want to hear about.
Clearly, we were after a bit of a introspective thought about being an editor in urban studies. And we started by putting Catalina, to be frank, quite in a box, right? We sort of asked her to be the problematic category of the Latin American, and Latin America as a virtual special issue and as an editor. And I think she does a really great job there in calling ourselves out, including herself in many ways as an editorial collective, and being more attent to who can actually afford to publish in our context, who can access the research we put out there, what can we do to change. And it's so refreshing to just be honest about the problems we operate within, don't you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. And it was really interesting for Catalina to draw those connections between those more structural challenges and then the issue of the generalizations of urbanization in Latin America perpetuating because of the absence of the representation of more varied cities because of those structural issues. And so I thought it was such a clear sort of relationship between all of that she made. And I was just enjoying the conversation so much. I was so deeply into what she was saying that we then found ourselves lost.
Thank you so much for explaining that. I could have sworn... Oh, there is. Sorry, last time Michele took me down here just as I arrived at the conference the other day. And I was, in my mental imaginary, there was another garden here and we've encountered a dead end, but I can see the staircase down.
Okay, it's fine. That is the beauty of just wandering around the city.
Exactly.
So there's my proof that you can have a geography PhD and still be terrible at directions. But once we were back on track, I asked Catalina about another strand of her recent work, her cultivation of stories in her urban scholarship.
Well, I've been, a lot of the kind of the empirical grounding of my work has been around the city of Medellin. And by working with the idea of and kind of giving a critical perspective of why Medellin has become, or at some point, like an urban model or an urban miracle that has been described for some scholars, how we can, at the end of the day, what was traveling was the story that practitioners also wanted to tell, like a partial story of the transformation of the city in a way, but also this eagerness of practitioners, particularly across the world, to have solutions ready-made to very staggering problems. And in this case, how do you work in tandem issues around informality and also violence that are so critical in governing cities nowadays across the world. And in that way, I got interested in what was the story that was traveling, what was the story that was not told, who were the storytellers that were excluded of this quote-unquote success story, and at what expense that success was being made. And by navigating that kind of a strand of research, it became very clear to me that when I was doing several interviews with people that work around, let's say, housing justice more in general, across different contexts, something that was coming up a lot was this idea that we need to change the narrative in order to address and come up with alternative strategies and intervention and ways of framing urban interventions. And then this change of narrative became, in a way, the axis of my research. And then I started engaging with the idea that on the one hand, stories are tools to learn, and we all need to learn about other cities. But then what are the different strategies to craft and to bring different storytellers into the picture and problematize and give like a fuller account of the messy urban processes of urban transformation in the city. And that's why I became interested more in kind of the genealogies of, why storytelling also resonates a lot with kind of the colonial epistemologies and methodologies. But also what is the pedagogical potential of engaging in the story crafting, storytelling, and how urban narratives determine it to a bigger extent, as Leonie Sandercock said since 2003, the way in which we frame our even imagination of what is possible to do and transform in the cities.
Yes. Thank you again for explaining that. And I know that some of the listeners of this podcast will be students of various different stages. Being inspired by everything that you're saying and wondering methodologically some of the ways that you followed the stories and you navigated storytelling in your work in Medellin and other cities.
Yeah, so part of the work we did in some of the research projects started by tracing, even using the idea of how to use transmedia storytelling to learn across cities. About urban processes, and in particularly, I've been interested in how neighborhood upgrading can be framed differently. So in this process, we thought it was more about the city or the particular processes, but then soon we realized we needed to operationalize this, and kind of the magic of bringing these methodologies that bring issues of storytelling is having the capacity to bring together people from different strands, different capacities in the asymmetric constellation of power. So city makers of different walks of life, where while being identified, everyone as an urban storyteller could actually come together and think and discuss and create and imagine different ways of doing. So we created a toolkit for using storytelling as an urban learning tool.
Yes.
And we crafted several activities to understand how you bring people together. That goes beyond the narrative itself, but creating what I have called later affective infrastructures to be able to be away from your role and try to connect from an emotional perspective first, creating a space for more trust and more human connection before engaging fully in the, so making it a more affective and embodied experience to engage now with the storytelling and using different strategies for plotting a story, but most importantly, understanding and negotiating what are the core messages that the collective that you're working with want to portray. So in this case, because the main purpose was trying to debunk the myths of the Medellin model and try to tell the other stories that haven't been told, then we were very clear in having a particular objective and trying to work from the myths and trying to see and think what is the story that can help us engage with the aspects that have been either problematic or that haven't been told, or the stories that the different participants wanted to portray.
And if you're interested in finding out more, we'll actually provide links to that toolkit in our show notes. So what did you take away from Catalina just said there, Michele?
In many ways, as the episode title hints at, the story of storytelling is a really, really powerful one that Catalina puts the spotlight on for us, or the microphone, I guess, in this case. But it also connects to some of the other episodes that we've had in this mini-series on the power and the eagerness of urbanists to make stories travel, and often those stories that travel are stories of success. And I think Catalina really calls us out from that perspective of asking ourselves about who the storytellers are, what are these stories, and that perhaps we have to attend to a bigger variety, as she says, of city makers that come from different walks of life.
And picking up again with Catalina's own walk of life, we asked her to take us to a place of her choosing that has had a significant influence on the ideas that she's been forming in the strands of work and scholarship that we've just been hearing about, that she's been building over her urban studies career and trajectory.
Yeah, well, it's very close to my heart, the neighborhood of Moravia in Medellin, and particularly my article on storytelling otherwise. It starts and ends with, and is weaved through the story of Mama Chila, the women that have been literally working the city from scratch and providing infrastructures of care. And that has been a very big inspiration for me, and thinking, how can we even produce a different scholarship, and a scholarship that is also attuned to the needs, concerns, and practices of the people that usually don't make it to the big stages of urban debates. And what would it look like, a city that is, shaped also after understanding how this other type of infrastructures has been shaped by women that have been, enduring a lot of difficulties, but nonetheless have been able to protect and put life in the center. So Moravia, for me, has been a space of learning, inspiration, and getting also somehow a very important place for a space of a bit of political incidence in terms of having a long engagement process with the communities that I've been working with for several years already. So that would be one of my places close to heart, to my scholarship, but also tons of friends and people that are very close to my heart.
And I think we're about to stumble into a really meaningful conversation and a really meaningful thought about the power of serendipity in urban studies. So we really want to give Catalina that last word back on the walk.
Yeah, well, that sometimes, academics have a very neat narrative about what they are doing, and for me, it has been perhaps more messy, more connected to practice, with engagement with communities, but also working with policymakers. So I feel that my scholarship has been coming through those cracks. And by not having a kind of a clear plot up front, but kind of surrendering to the serendipities of this engagement and commitment to co-creation process has brought me to talk about and learn about processes around living heritage, living archives, care infrastructures, things that I would have never thought, memory spaces, healing, reconciliation. I'm now very obsessed with territorial healing in moments when the world is broken. I think healing and repair and reparative strategies, practices, and thinking about what are the urban reparative knowledges that we'll be needing to cultivate more. So all this kind of journey is leading me to think and work through these concepts. And I would have never intended or, even foresee me engaging with these topics. I was looking at my Facebook today and it popped up a picture of me presenting 8 years ago in the same conference, something related to how you heal cities or something like that. It was a very early approach and I completely forgot about it, but now the presentation we did in this conference was a more refined, more grounded aspect that, I never thought I could be, working through several years. So also thinking in the long durée of your own engagement with cities would be something, that sometimes you don't plan, but they just emerges more organically, I would say.
Oh, what a fantastic way and a reassuring way to end for those of us who may not feel like we have the game plan for urban studies. Thank you so much for that, Catalina.
Caitlin, what did you take away from your walk with Catalina more generally?
I really enjoyed this conversation with Catalina. What an honour it was to spend a little bit of time with her amid the busy conferencing schedule and just to take a moment to decompress and to hear all about her really fantastic work. I took away a few things, certainly in relation to the recent work that she's been doing in really dispelling the myth of Latin American urbanization generalizations, and the way that she's been drawing our attention to the combination of ontological problems and the ways that cities are seen, which we've heard a lot about so far in the series, and the way that that's really combined with, and probably a symptom of, structural inequalities in funding, which then affect the distributed representation of Latin American cities on scholarship in all urban studies journals. So I thought that that was really valuable. It was really great to hear about her motivations for doing that and her process. The second highlight for me was Catalina's use of stories and storytelling as tools for learning, but also for capturing the messiness of urban processes of change. And something that came through from what she was saying for me was that it's potentially more democratizing than just hearing the urban stories that find platforms because they're told by people with more formal power. I really like that she also drew our attention to that too as a method, and I think a lot of listeners maybe conceiving of projects will be probably thinking about how they could use storytelling in their work as well. And I loved that she acknowledged that everybody has a story to tell, and that story is worth listening to. The final thing that was really meaningful for me was Catalina's final note on serendipity, and this idea that some of the ideas or seeds that we have stay with us even when they have become subconscious, and then can reveal themselves to us at any time when we least expect it, or they can be a kind of thread in the work that we do without us even realizing until we sort of sit down to think about it, or we're confronted with presenting on a topic that we feel like we've presented on before because we probably have. And I really love that. I like the idea that serendipity is sort of ticking away and has possibilities in all of our trajectories in urban studies, even when it may not feel like the path is that clear. Maybe it's clearer than we think. So I really liked that as a final note. What did you take away from the conversation, Michele?
So much. I actually would point out specifically the fact that I got into it really keen to hear about Catalina's reflections and work on storytelling. And then she took us into storytelling beyond the narrative. She has this really great nudge to attend to the affective infrastructures, to think through the emotional experience too. And it's such a refreshing way of putting us into place, but with the feelings that the urbanist has, not just the stories themselves. And I think in many ways it takes us to her reflecting on place that is close to, she says, close to the heart, that convenes an emotion. And that emotion, she really points, I guess, going to your point on the storytellings that provide power to tell alternative ways in which we can think through cities, is that convening and conveying the inspiration, care, the attention for people, reparative knowledge, as she puts it. So that there's a lot of emotion in there, in a place that perhaps I didn't expect. Perhaps I was really warm to hear. And I think the bit that stands out to me as a wrap up is also her call for not dissing and potentially embracing, quite emotionally in many ways, the messier and, as she says, less neat scholarship, that there's a place for something that is a little more constructed around feelings and stories and an urban studies, she says, that comes through the cracks. And I really like that kind of expression of urban studies that seeps in full of emotions. So in many ways, I'm now doubly aware of cracks in our walks. In many ways, I'm doubly aware of the emotions we're going to come across in other episodes. But for the time being, I think that was a roller coaster. I think we're really grateful to yet another editor of Urban Studies. So there you have it, Catalina Ortiz talking us through Latin American cities, storytelling, and serendipity. And I think, Caitlin, until the next adventure out, thanks everyone for listening, and thanks for coming out with Catalina and us.
Walking the City With is a peer-reviewed mini-series by the Urban Studies Journal with the University of Bristol and the University of Melbourne. Produced by Caitlin Morrissey in Manchester, Julia Macbeth in Glasgow, Kate Murray in Melbourne, and Michele Acuto in Bristol. Thank you for listening.